As to the charge of first-degree murder, verdict as to count 1. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty, so say we all, dated at Orlando, Orange County, Florida, on this 5th day of July, 2011, signed.
Good afternoon. We're interrupting the start of Oprah to bring you a special report on the verdict in the Casey Anthony trial in Orlando. I'm Michael Williams.
And I'm Shannon Cake. It took a jury in Orlando a little more than 10 hours to reach its verdict, acquitting Casey Anthony of all of the major charges in this case.
Casey Anthony, as we look through the case, fought back tears as the verdicts were read. This is the emotional moment in that courtroom just a few short hours ago, just after 2:15 this afternoon. She could have received the death penalty if she'd been convicted of first-degree murder. Her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee, disappeared in June of 2008. Her remains found in the woods near her grandparents' home in December of that year. Casey Anthony, again found not guilty of all the major charges. Her parents were central parts of this case, called to testify numerous times during the trial. After the verdict was read, her parents quietly walked out of the courtroom.
And Lee Anthony, her brother, never in court today at all. Here is the breakdown of the verdict today. First-degree murder, not guilty. Aggravated manslaughter, not guilty. Aggravated child abuse, not guilty. She was found guilty in 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers.
And we will be speaking to legal experts we have assembled here in our News Channel 5 newsroom in just a moment about whether or not she will be walking essentially out of jail in a few days, because she's already been in jail 3 years, and these charges, what will be the cumulative time she'd serve on the, I will call them minor charges, not reporting properly to police. We'll talk about that in a moment. Orlando, you have to understand, though, is a city where this has been wall-to-wall coverage on every television station, start to finish, of this trial. And so there's been quick and emotional reaction outside that courthouse this day.
Many have called it a mob scene of sorts. Carolyn Schofield, our Carolyn Schofield, has been covering this trial almost from the very start. Carolyn, what are you seeing and hearing at this hour?
Well, Shannon and Michael, as you mentioned, the interest in this case has only grown since it first began more than 3 years ago. And the number of news organizations that have been here outside the Orange County Courthouse has grown since even the beginning of the trial. In fact, now I was just doing a count. I can see about 8 live truck masts up, unknown number of how many satellite dishes I can see up just in the area where we are. Now, we are across the street from the Orange County Courthouse in an area dubbed by the media as Camp Casey. And as that verdict was getting ready to be read this afternoon, you could just feel the energy here. So many people have been following this trial since the very beginning, just waiting to hear that verdict that came down. And I think the sense among all of us here was that Casey might face might be charged with some of those crimes, or might rather be found guilty of some of those crimes. And then as they began reading the verdict, there was a big crowd gathering across the street at the Orange County Courthouse. Let's go ahead to that video we just sent in. A large crowd of people were gathering, and actually, as I was walking across the street before the verdict was read, a man passed by on Orange Avenue in a U-Haul truck, and he was yelling, "Hang her, hang her." So a lot of people had the idea that Casey Anthony would be found guilty of these crimes, the crime of killing her daughter Kaylee. But after that verdict was read, the crowd certainly didn't disperse at all. In fact, it seemed like more people were coming forward, and a lot of people taking pictures of all of us in the media that were there waiting to see who would come out of the courthouse. But a lot of people were simply shocked by the verdict, and they didn't really know what to do. They just wanted to stand there and maybe try to make some sense of this all. Go ahead and hear this from Linda Kelly of Daytona Beach.
I've been following this case for 3 years, and I just wanted to be here for the verdict.
What's your reaction to the verdict, not guilty?
I feel like crying. I just, you know.
And I was just trying to look over there at the Orange County Courthouse to see if there are still people gathering. It's hard to see. We've got a wall in between us and the courthouse itself. But a lot of people simply really didn't know what to do. They were standing around saying they wanted justice for Kaylee. And as far as the state of Florida goes and the crime itself, this is the justice that's been served today. So I think a lot of people here were unhappy with the verdict. Now, we're also watching some of the local stations from Orlando here that have been doing coverage. They have multiple crews all over the place, and they've showed people in the neighborhood of Casey Anthony's home, and there are more people gathering there. Now, just a few minutes ago, and you're going to touch on this in a second a little bit more, but the sheriff of Orange County spoke, and he begged people to maintain peace. They might be upset with this verdict, but he asked the people of Orange County and really the state of Florida and anybody who's come down here and shown an interest in this case to be peaceful with this verdict. Michael and Shannon, back to you.
Carolyn, have you been surprised as a reporter? You've covered these types of trials over the years many, many times. Yesterday we heard of folks traveling from around the world, from one woman from Germany, to hear the verdict in this case. Have you been surprised as a reporter to see the passion in this trial?
I think so. I've never covered a case of this magnitude, but I don't really think any of us have. But I guess I'm surprised about how many people are simply fascinated by this. And I would even see the updates on Facebook and Twitter, people who said they spent their entire July 4th holiday glued to the television set, watching the proceedings in this. It surprised me that so many people were so, I guess, interested in this case. Shannon?
And also, we talk about the jurors deliberating for 10 hours, and we'll talk to our experts in a moment, but we were all a bit surprised, if you can use that term, just in a case of this magnitude, and I wondered what the reaction there was, one way or the other, that they came back with the verdict and really came from behind closed doors after 10 hours. And when you subtract the time of filling out jury forms, organizing, picking a jury foreman, the deliberations were clearly less than that, perhaps significantly so. Was that a major surprise in and of itself to the people who'd covered this throughout and to people in and out of the courtroom?
Well, Michael, I have some colleagues up here that I used to work with when I worked here in Orlando, and I was following them and paying attention to what they were saying, especially on Twitter. And they said this morning that the jurors came in all dressed up. They got a sense that there would possibly be a verdict today because all the jurors were dressed nicely. But they tweeted their reaction as the verdict was being read. And in fact, they said one of the jurors burst out into tears. So this has not been an easy decision for them at all. And in fact, after the verdict was read, the jurors were given the option to speak to the media, and all 12 of them, including the 5 alternates, declined. They are now on their way back to Pinellas County.
Carolyn, I'm curious, what was it like in the press room? Were you in that press room when the court spokesperson came out and said that no member of this jury chose to give us even an inkling of what was going through their minds as they came up with this verdict?
I have to tell you, Shannon, we were actually downstairs outside the Orange County Courthouse waiting to see who would be coming out those front doors, so I did not see that. I think a lot of us, though, weren't surprised because if you think about all the people who have been so passionate about this case, just the people who are watching everything that's been going on, there are a lot of people who, I mean, just standing out there in front of the courthouse were upset about this. So I don't know if I think if I were a juror and had returned a verdict like this, I'm not sure if I'd want to put my name and my face out there just because of the people who might have a violent reaction of some sort to this.
Carolyn Schofield, who's been covering the trial throughout and will continue to stand by outside the Orlando courthouse, assessing reaction, legal and otherwise. We thank you. It's worth noting again that the jurors had to be picked from outside the Orange County area because of the publicity surrounding this case. They picked their jurors in Pinellas County, which was difficult enough. And some said early on that it was hyperbole to suggest that this case would become more famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, than the OJ case. But you think about a 16-year gap between cases in the Twitter world we live in, the Facebook world, all of that, the online world where everybody has an opinion. All of us are seeing slices of the reality in that courtroom. And so your emotions, whatever they may be about this, are magnified that much more in the world we live in. You see part of that outside that courtroom today. And in that vein, there was a lot of discussion right after the verdict came down of how much the media played in all of this. There's always a discussion with a high-profile case like this, and particularly when the death penalty is at the end of the line on things like this, but how much the media plays into this, and are they the 13th juror in all of this, and how much that should be limited. So a healthy conversation, of course, going on, as always, after this case. We want to remind you that we're in special coverage. We will be going to Oprah after our special coverage, but we want to continue for the time being. Right now, we want to hear from Casey Anthony's attorney. He spoke shortly after the verdict was rendered, just after 2:15 this afternoon. Jose Baez, who was a little-known lawyer in that area, now one of the most famous lawyers, at least for the moment, in the country. Here's what he had to say in part to reporters after the verdict, not guilty on all the major charges, was rendered.
While we're happy for Casey, there are no winners in this case. Kaylee has passed on far, far too soon. And what my driving force has been for the last 3 years has been always to make sure that there has been justice for Kaylee and Casey. Because Casey did not murder Kaylee.
We're joined now by legal analyst Michelle Suskauer and a defense attorney, also former prosecutor Michael O'Rourke to my right. Thanks both for being here. Jose Baez just saying right now that there are no winners in this case, but didn't Casey Anthony win in this? Michelle?
Well, she did. She did. I mean, she still has 4 convictions now for lying to law enforcement, but she did have her life saved by her attorneys. And this, you know, the thing that really bothered me throughout this, and there was always that picture, justice for Kaylee, justice for Kaylee. That's not really true. It was not justice for Kaylee, it was justice for Kaylee equals conviction for Casey. That's really what that meant. That was sort of subliminal. But there was justice today. We may not agree with it. Some people may not agree with it, may be very upset with it, but you have to respect the jury's verdict here and be calm about it. It's very emotional. People followed this like never before, but it was our justice system at work. And we should all respect that.
Let's bring both of your perspectives in here, both Michelle's and Michael O'Rourke, longtime prosecutor in Palm Beach County. Is this a case where, and again, look, second guessing is going to be so easy on all sides, but you do have to ask, this was not a case where you had direct evidence that could link Casey Anthony to the death of her child, and so, therefore it will always beg the question, did they perhaps overcharge? Did they overreach? Was a first-degree murder capital case something that was beyond their reach, given that the case was largely, really, totally built out of circumstantial evidence, no matter how strong?
Well, that's one of the things that a prosecutor always has to make a determination as to what the specific charge should be. In this case, after listening to the closing, I didn't hear the actual testimony, but listening to the closing arguments, it sounded as if in a circumstantial case such as this, they had evidence that would show guilt, and that because they had that evidence, it was proper for the judge to evaluate that evidence and then send it to the jury. Now, the real issue is the issue of whether or not, I like to call it the common sense test, whether this jury understood that in a circumstantial evidence case, you don't necessarily have somebody pointing and saying, that's the person. You don't have somebody saying, I have a photograph of this. It's information that's gathered from about. And you put that evidence together, and it has to pass the common sense test. Does this all fit together? Does this tend to show that Casey Anthony did this?
Bottom line, and briefly before we go to break, were you surprised that she was found guilty, not guilty on all the major charges?
I was, yes.
And Michelle, you were too.
We were sitting here listening to the verdict, and we were shaking our heads, shocked. Shocked. I really, but what they did was they disregarded the scientific evidence, and I think they really hated George Anthony. It was really one family member sacrificed for another family member.
And in that sense, a defense strategy that from a legal in the courtroom perspective worked. This case became a lot about her mom and dad, and very specifically, Casey Anthony's dad.
It was all about this family dynamic. That's what this really was about, and I think that information that George Anthony threw out, Michael, I don't know if you agree with this, with the information that was thrown out about George Anthony allegedly sexually abusing his daughter, which there was no evidence of. It was only mentioned in opening statement. Couldn't even argue about it in closing arguments because there was no evidence. I think that stuck with that jury. So I think they hated George Anthony.
Even those very powerful tapes that you heard of Casey lying to not only investigators but her family members could not overcome that.
I think they really disliked George Anthony and obviously didn't believe her.
We will come back in just a moment with more expert legal analysis. Please stay with us as our special coverage of the Casey Anthony not guilty verdict on all major charges continues right here on News Channel 5.